So, class, we're going to talk about economic challenges that face businesses of today. Contemporary business is the terminology that your book uses, but we won't get into all that. We're just going to talk about what are the challenges that businesses face. And then we may even get into the reasons why, and ultimately in other chapters talk about how to resolve those issues. Um, the objectives are going to be, we're going to talk about the microeconomics. What is it really? What is macroeconomics? But also how does it impact or shape the forces of supply and demand, and then the issues that affect the entire economy. This is a big picture view of business and its role in the economy. That's very, very important. We're going to talk about how to evaluate economic performance. We're going to also discuss how to manage the economy's performance. And we're going to talk about the global challenges of the 21st century, which is a complicated issue all in itself. So we're going to really touch base on all of these things, and the details of these specific items are going to be a different course all to themselves. So we will be getting a very general overview. So don't lose heart. We're going to get too into it, but not too deep where it gets too complicated. Economics is analysis of people and governments and allocated resources. And I'm going to say scarce resources because that's very important, because resources that we have available to us is not unlimited. They will somehow go away, and our job is to use them in the best and the most efficient way possible. And when that includes they're looking at the big picture, which is the macro view, and the micro view is going to be the very, very specific, which is probably a more complicated view. Supply and demand really does talk about um, um, the supply of goods and services at various prices and the willingness of others to buy it, pretty much, and that's the demand side of it. It really is talking about people, companies, businesses. So I mean, sometimes there's business to business type of transactions. Sometimes there's individual consumers themselves in those transactions. So we're not going to exclude any. We're going to include everybody um, in that process. What drives demand? This supply curve, do not lose heart. This is something that's fundamental in economics. But what it says is the higher the prices, the lower the demand. The lower the prices, the higher the demand. So when prices go up, the quantity demanded changes. So if you look at the first demand curve for gasoline and the change in quantity demanded, you will see at $2.50 the demand for the quantity is at 20. But as the price goes up to $2.90 or $2.99, the quantity goes down to what, 15, maybe 18. And even still, when the prices go up to $3.39, the quantity goes down from maybe 14 or 15 down to 11. So the general rule is, as the demand goes down, it is going down as a result of a higher price. So there is a inverse relationship between price and demand. Now, if you look at the curve for part B, a shift in demand curve for an item. This is just saying that the demand has shifted. There is a new demand curve, and there may very well be some indicators that changed it. So no longer is it demand curve in the yellow space, but a blue space. And there are some specific items and specific instances where the demand curve will just shift outward. And all of these details will be discussed in further classes. Like any other item that we talk about, marketing, accounting, human resources, and business law, we are not going to be talking about the nitty gritty. We're going to give you a very brush and a wide stroke on the broad base of business. So with all the details of accounting and all of that stuff, you'll probably see in Accounting 100. We will touch it a little bit, but not too much. So, factors that drive demand, we're going to show how people deal with it. Its factors are like competition, it's like price, it's like economic events, and it's like customer preferences. These are the things that will affect how much or if someone decides to buy it. And this just gives you a narrative, and you'll see this in your book. If the factor in this case is the customer preference, so it's going to increase if the customer preference wants to, if it's going to be something that they want. So a shift to the right is going to show an increase. A shift to the left is going to show a decrease. If your number of buyers increase, it's going to show a shift to the right. And this is just showing you how to interpret that graph. And don't lose heart because this is not overly complicated, one. And secondly, all the details of how this demand curve and supply curve work will be discussed in extraordinary detail when you're in the economics course. I'm going to go for it. So what drives supply? The same thing that drives demand, but on the opposite side. One is going to be the cost of inputs. Inputs means the amount of money that's invested in creating that item. The technology and changes in technology sometimes create additional costs. I mean, maybe more expensive to maintain technology to even compete with your competitors. Taxes will also make a difference, and the number of suppliers. So if the supply curve is going to shift if any of those factors are in place. Production plays a role, and the supply curve is going to show the relationship between them. The main point that you'll need to learn here is when there is a shift in supply, the supply curve, the general rule is going to be the inputs, the technology, taxes, or suppliers. Those types of changes are going to automatically cause the supply curve to shift either to the right or to the left, depending on whether or not that shift. I'm sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. So we want to make sure we go forward. Okay. Now, this is the supply curve and the demand curve. Now, if we look at the supply curve and you see at the quantity at 10 and it's $2.59 a gallon, they have the ability to supply more to the consumers. So they're going to supply more. So that's going to cause a shift to the right. And that shift to the right means an increase in the quantity supplied of gasoline. And the quantity, and when the supplier, when the increase in the supply of the supplied, of the quantity supplied causes a shift outward, that means the price is going to go higher. And as the price gets higher, they are able to provide even more. So this is on the supply side. So for example, a BP, okay, we can supply more because now it's going to cost us less to supply more. And now we can charge more. So if we can raise that price, we can provide more. If we raise that price even more, we're going to provide more. But there is a price to that. There's a cost to them not only supplying more at a higher price, but what's going to be the opposite side? The demand is going to be the opposite side. So what happens is when you see the supply curve go up and you see the changes in price, that means an increase in the change in price is going to create an environment where the organization can provide more. They can supply more. But the price of that is going to be the quantity demanded is going to decrease. So there is an inverse relationship here. This graph here shows how they interact. At what point does the price and the quantity meet? And it looks like it meets at $2.90 and possibly at the, if I look at the graph, I'm probably around 18 million gallons quantity-wise. And this is important because an organization certainly does not want to have an oversupply of their product and not being sold, because that will force them to decrease the price. By decreasing the price, they will then increase the quantity demanded. And we'll talk about this in more detail and give some more examples, but these relationships are very much inverse. The higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. The lower the quantity, the lower the price, the least amount will be supplied, and the higher will be demanded. So organizations want to find that place where it meets. If the amount that we're going to supply is going to meet what our demand is, we're less likely to lose money. So if you look at the two supply and demand curves and see where they meet, one portion of the graph at the bottom half, I'm going to try to put my arrow here. Let me see if I can draw. Okay, at this point here, if you look at this point here, what does that cause? And at this point here, what does this point cause? This point here, if we go under the equilibrium price, you're more likely to suffer a shortage. I'm going to put this word shortage. Pardon my my writing. Put an A there. This here is going to result in a surplus. And we all know what a surplus is. A surplus means it's too much. So if we got here, we're talking about a surplus because the price has gone too high and not many people are demanding it. This is over and above the equilibrium price. We got a surplus. So in order to get rid of that surplus, we're going to have to decrease price. That's going to have to happen. We're going to have to decrease our price because now we have too much of that supply. But what happens here, if the equilibrium price is $2.90 and we go to $2.80, if you're looking at that, we're probably going to have a decrease in a shortage in the quantity supplied. So the shortage occurs when the price and the quantity are below the equilibrium, and we have a surplus when the price and the quantity is above the equilibrium. I hope that makes sense. So what we want to do is we want to find that place so that we are right where we need to be, right here, the $2.90 and the $20 million gallon supply. In the law, it just is not a hard and fast rule. But what we want to do is supply what we know we're going to sell. We don't want to supply too much where we have a surplus, and we don't want to supply not enough where we have a shortage. So we're always working with that price and the shifting of the supply and demand of that quantity to get us right to that optimum level, and that optimum level is at $2.90. Okay, I'm going to go to the next page. Okay, supply curve example. We just went through that. Let's see. So, supply curve, it meets at the equilibrium price. Buyers and sellers make choices that restore it. Again, based on their choices, it will bring it up or down. And they both have an effect on the supply and demand. So at macroeconomics is going to be the big picture. Macro here is going to be the big picture. Let me go back. So, private enterprise system, capitalist system, or market economy. Planned economies, which is not a part of the United States, socialism and communism, and most mixed economies, is a combination of the two. I would say that the United States is probably mixed. We're mostly capitalistic and a market economy, but there are some components of our economy that is a mixed. So I would say we're more likely to be a mixed economy. Okay. Now, a private enterprise system and competition. Really, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we care about the needs of the customers and we are rewarded with our profit. The government keeps its hands off, generally speaking. Obviously, government needs resources in order for it to run, so taxes is a part of that, but it does not have anything to do with how our organization is being run by the owners. There are some rules that governs how you interact with employees, but that's a different issue which we're talking about today. Competition is going to regulate. Now, we want competition. There are some cases where it is impossible to have competition, and one is going to be in the electric, the gasoline, and in probably transportation. And generally, the government is very much involved in those types of organizations because, first of all, it is nearly impossible for a person of my size or you to be able to own a transportation system. We just don't have the resources. It's too big. It's too huge. So the government is almost always involved in terms of providing subsidies to help whoever decides to organize transportation. And in some cases, like the state of Maryland and Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they do have their own transportation system, which again is subsidized by localities, and you and I pay a little fee to get on. So transportation is a big deal, and the government is heavily involved, but those are exceptions to the rule and not the rule itself. But degrees of competition is going to be pure competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. The only oligopoly that I can think of really is going to be the transportation and electricity. BGE is one kind of BGE where there's very few organizations providing that service, very few. BGE in Maryland and Med Ed in, I think, in York County are just examples. I can't remember. I can't think of a monopoly in this case. I don't know if we have a monopoly right now. Monopolistic competition is going to be many buyers, many providers of that type of service. And you can write a book on all the the monopolistic competition. Pure competition where no one has any control whatsoever over the price. It is purely an interaction between the customers and who and what they want. And this gives you really the types of competition and the comparisons among them. I would most certainly keep this particular page in mind because it's going to be important, not necessarily in this course, but I think mostly when you're talking about macroeconomics and when you get involved in marketing, you're going to see these types of things again because I think they're particularly relevant in those two courses. Planned economies, government controls determine business ownership, property, and resources. Now, we do not have this type of organization structure for our economy, but it does exist, and you need to know. I mean, particularly if you decide to expand outside of the borders of the United States, you're going to need to know the kind of economies that are out there and how your organization can fit, if it can fit in those types of economies. And communism is just one. Socialism is another. I mean, it owns major industries like healthcare or communications. In this country, we are moving more closely to socialism when it comes to healthcare simply because of the Affordable Care Act, and we're actually putting a lot of pressure on health insurance companies to be more fair and not to exclude people simply because of pre-existing conditions. But we're still not a socialist country, but we're definitely moving in that direction in terms of certain acts that have happened in the past 10 years. Nevertheless, some private ownership is allowed. Now, we are not a socialist country, but we do have some areas where there are some very stark similarities. Mixed market, which more likely mixed is us for the most part, because we're not purely a capitalistic or economy. We are in many ways, but there are some exceptions, and so I would say now we're more mixed than anything. But it combines the private enterprise and the planned economies. It's a mixture of public and private enterprise, and you know how that is, and that's about public transportation, public utilities, and the list goes on. So we're really mixed, and we can give you examples upon examples of where the government steps in to say, I'm not going to allow anyone to privatize this. It's impossible for them to control price. They'll take advantage of the consumers, and we're just not going to do it. And we're going to be involved in it. And if you want to change your price, you're going to have to come through us. And it served well, and it's still serving well at this point. And here is a comparison, or in this case, a contrast of the various different planned economies versus the capitalist system, which is what we have for the most part, and the mixed part of our economy, which is we're becoming more and more mixed. But nevertheless, this is a chart that I think you will need to understand and use, and I will not go over the minute details, but you need to understand that the capitalistic, which is right here, let me go back, see if I can get this thing to behave. Okay, let me put my drawer, and this is more like the U.S. If I can write, let me see. I can't get it to work, but this is the United States here, for the most part. We started, I would say, this country in the capitalistic area, but as globalization has become our life and things have changed so much in the past 100 years, we are more likely to be a mixed economy. In entrepreneurs entitled to their investments, we choose our workers. In some cases, we are unionized. We do provide incentives that would influence public sector activities. We manage our own professionals, also work, and we have a private sector blends. I mean, it's really becoming more blend. But you cannot overlook the fact that ownership of enterprises are strictly owned by individuals or private. They have their own right to their profits. They have the right to choose their own occupation and to hire who they please. And it's in a considerable incentive to people to perform at their highest level. So we are very much a capitalistic firm, a capitalist economy, but we are certainly starting to show a tremendous amount of mixed economy attributes, and that's important to know. everyone wants sustained growth. And for the past a few years, in 2008, 2009, when we went through this recession and everything was, prices were going crazy and people were high unemployment, it was very, very difficult. Stable businesses need a stable economy to grow. It's just that simple. So when we're going through prosperity, when people are confident and businesses are growing and people are getting paid what they're worth and there's no layoffs or very few layoffs, we're doing well. But we have to understand too that we have to go through this cycle, and it's going to be another one of those cycles that you talk about, where you go through growth and then you go through a stagnant period where it's actually going to go down, and then you go back up to sustainable growth. And that's a very normal process. It's just that we don't want to stay too long in a place where we're actually not growing as much and the prices are fairly high, and we want to limit that point. But we also have to know that we're going to experience these cycles. We've experienced it when we dealt with the 2008, where it was going down and down and down, and we bottomed out pretty much. And we stayed low, and we stayed low, and we stayed low, and then now we're starting to see it going up. It's going up quite slowly. The economy is still in very, very serious situation, but it is going in the right direction. So in a recession, something where we're having contraction, when and a contraction is when everything gets tightened up, and it lasts for longer than 6 months. And we basically have gone through this through the 2008 to 2011 periods, and that was the longest recession I think that we've had in decades. It was a majorly almost 5 years. Many people thought we were going to slip into a depression, but the government generally steps in. That being said, we just need to make certain that we are also thinking about all these kinds of things when we're dealing with recovery and declining unemployment. And that's why every month we get these numbers from the government saying the unemployment rate has gone down and business activity has improved, because that does let us know that people are having more confidence in the economy and things are looking better for us. The GDP, gross domestic product, and that's just telling you what the productivity is, how productive our economy is in the workforce. And it's going to be the outputs divided by the inputs, and it's just giving you an example of that. And this is, again, what's the goods and services produced and the inputs needed to produce them. That's basically in the productivity definition. So the GDP is going to be a sum of all those and produced in a nation's boundaries, and it's a measure of at a national level. And generally that's going to be tracked by the United States government and Department of Commerce. The main thing you'll need to know is the GDP does measure how healthy an organization is or how healthy a nation is. And generally, if the nation's not healthy, inflation is going to be the next thing that's going to hit. So here we are, price level changes. Inflation is caused by a combination of excessive demand and increases in cost. So inflation equals high price. And when they talk about CPI, let me see if I can draw a picture. I'll see if it will work. When you talk about a CPI, we're basically talking about the level C. Let me see if I can do it. P. It's not working too good. I. Oh, that doesn't look too good. But we're talking about the CPI. I know that doesn't look too nice. In the CPI is really how expensive things are, and that rate, which is the inflationary rate, is going to say how expensive. If we're having a time of high prices, we're dealing with high inflation. And so the CPI rate is going to measure the inflation minus the cost of goods and services. We want to be able to know how expensive things are and why things are expensive. So when we see price level changes, we're going to have to make certain that we're dealing with true inflation, which is going to be the combination of excessive demand and increasing cost of raw materials. Inflation rates, and it's going to also deal with the demand pull inflation, which is going to be more on the demand side, more excessive customers wanting a product and a limited supply of that product. Then the cost push is going to be the cost. How much is going to get more expensive? It's more costly to produce the same item that you did 2 years ago. So, and hyperinflation, which has not happened in this nation, at least as far as the past 40 years, happens when prices just goes through the roof. And that happens when you're in a depression. It generally doesn't happen in a recession. These two items here, the demand pull and the cost pull, is going to be during a recession, or when you're moving in a direction of a recession. Hyperinflation is more in depression. I think in the 1930s we were having depression when there was soup lines and et cetera, et cetera. So when we talk about inflation, the value of money goes down. You can buy less with the same amount of money, and you know this very well because a car used to cost $5,000. Now it's 25,000. That is inflation, inflationary impact on the price. So the CPI is going to be tracking changes in prices. It's going to tell you how, what I will say, what inflation, what will be the price of inflation, what's going to be the monetary value of inflation. And inflation is high prices. Simple terminology, less complicated for this class, but inflation is high prices, and the CPI measures it. And again, the CPI is done on a monthly basis, but more or less, more likely, the annual number is going to be what we're going to be using, and that number determines really if we're going to be paying more for transportation, we're going to be paying more for medical care, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the components that make up that CPI. Cost of foods and beverages, education, housing, apparel, transportation, recreation, and other goods and services. Economic levels is also another factor to consider, and different types of unemployment is considered. Seasonal, obviously, farm workers will have some seasonal. Children who work in organizations that like Hershey Park, they will be seasonally unemployed because they work. The high demand for their jobs will be during the summer and spring months. Slowdown happens structurally when there's no more demand for that skill or for that particular job. And frictional unemployment is not looking for a job. Maybe it's new people, new graduates. And again, we're talking about how to measure the type of employment. Monetary policy, this determines the flow of money coming in and going out. So that number is kind of controlled through the government to make certain that we keep the prices under control and the rates of inflation under control. And this definitely has an impact on the interest rate. Interest rate affects everybody, whether you borrow money, whether banks, whether you receive interest on your particular investments. So it's important that we have a monetary policy that is very stable, so that we can ensure that the rates that are charged to us in terms of interest for borrowing will allow us to borrow. It can't be so high that we can't possibly borrow, because that would most certainly restrict our ability to borrow and have a negative impact on the economy and the monetary flow of money. Flow of money is important. Money meaning coming to me, going out to a business, and then the business take that money and pay employees, which in turn spend money to go back into the economy. It's a full circle, and one portion of that, a change in either one of those items could very well throw off the other, throw off the entire cycle. It's almost like a food web. One act affects another act, which affects another act, which affects another act. So it's important that for our country to be able to have a good control over the flow of money, so that the supply of money is not so much where the interest rate bottoms out, or the supply of money is so low that the interest rates skyrocket. We have to have that level of stability, and that's very important. And for the past 10 years, it's been watched very closely, simply because of the severe recession that this country had gone through. And the federal system does monitor implements the policy, and again, the president of the United States is involved in that. So they use that policy. They use it pretty much to control unemployment. So we increase spending and really reduce the severity of a recession. And you know this very well, because we have just gone through probably the worst recession in maybe 30 years. Fiscal policy and federal budget. These are, again, policies at the government level, at the federal government level, to be able to control spending, government spending, and spending in general, to keep the economy stable. We really want stability in our economy, not too going too well, but not going too poorly, that everyone will have what they need, but also the government will have what it needs in order to do its business. So we don't want a deficit. I mean, the national debt will increase at some point, but we want to ensure that we have that level of stability. So the federal fiscal policy has to consider what the impact will be on the debt, controlling that, and also on the structural deficit if there is one. If the government uses more money than it spends, receives more money than it spends, it has a surplus. And I don't believe we have a surplus at this point, but it is possible for the government to have a surplus. So at the global level, and we're talking outside our nation's boundaries, we need to make certain that we have the different challenges that we can deal with. One is going to be terrorism, and that's a big issue for everybody. Global information. Again, we are talking about being able to talk to people across the world. So we have to make sure that the information flow is huge. The population in the United States is growing. People are living longer, so that means we have to be able to deal with that from an economic perspective. But also growth in other countries do affect us as well, even though not directly. India and China, dealing with how their economy and how their population is growing out of control. But we also have to make certain that we're dealing with other countries and how it can affect our ability to get the resources that we need, because our nation does not provide all resources. We get it from other countries, including oil and other items. So the challenges are vast. But we are still going through those types of things, and I think as a whole, the economy within the United States is stable, but it's never going to be totally stable. It's going to have cycles where it's going to have to, it's going to go through these valleys and these peaks, and we went through one valley that lasted more than 3 or 4 years, and that's because of the recession. As we move out of recession into full recovery, we'll see a level of prosperity and a level of growth, and the inflation rate will obviously go down, which means if the inflation rate goes down, the prices of our goods and services will go down as well. And it all works out, and it all follows this cycle. As you read chapter 3, just remember that these are challenges that we face. These are the complicated things that all businesses have to deal with, and how they deal with those types of challenges will determine in many ways if they survive through them.